Are you going to do the video today? Yeah. Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and I have a cat in my lap. So if you hear purring, that's what that is. Yes, I know. This week, I wanted to start on my three-part series talking about the Aeneid by Virgil. This is a really fantastic epic poem that I think gets not ignored, but it sort of gets dismissed, and it isn't really given the same. Yes. It isn't given the same attention that Homer's epic poetry has, or even other ones like Beowulf or Paradise Lost. This definitely fits into the sort of grand canon of like great epic poems of the world, and it's a really interesting poem, and it's got some great history behind it. It's Roman mythology, so it's something that maybe some folks aren't as familiar with, and there's just a lot of cool stuff in here that we can talk about. So let's dive into it. So the Aeneid tells the story of Aeneas, who is set up as sort of the ancestor of Rome itself, and it tells the story of his voyages, returning from Troy, and then it also tells the story of kind of brutal conflict with the Latins in Italy, that upon winning that, it sort of lays the groundworks that will become Rome much later on. So before we dive into this, I wanted to start off by talking about some of the misconceptions about the Aeneid itself. So the first misconception that people have is they say that this is just sort of imperial propaganda, and it's not real art, and it's not really worth taking seriously. And there's a lot to unpack about that. It's a lot more complicated than that. So Virgil wrote the Aeneid towards the end of his life. It was sort of the third thing that he wrote. It's probably his best work that he ever wrote. Virgil was phenomenal, but he wrote it as a means of kind of legitimizing the links between the current emperor, which was Augustus, and the ancient history of Rome and its founding itself. So it's a way to kind of tie Aeneas to the current emperor. Originally, Virgil was going to write an epic that sort of told the story of sort of how Augustus came to power. You know, you've got Julius Caesar, and you've got the Battle of Actium against Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and then, you know, the events that led to the period of stability and prosperity under Caesar Augustus. And he didn't end up writing that story, but he ended up writing this epic poem, which sort of looks at the ancient history of Rome, and it's sort of it's one ancestor, if that makes sense, because Aeneas is set up as sort of the ancient ancestor of Romulus and Remus, and then they're the ones that sort of found Rome. But it's set up that Aeneas embodies all of the Roman characteristics. He's like the perfect Roman before Rome exists, and then it's because of his Romanness that he's able to sort of lay the groundworks for what will later become Rome. So we first met Aeneas in the Iliad, and he wasn't an invention by Homer. The character of Aeneas had sort of existed before that, and before Virgil, Aeneas had come to Italy in other variations of the story. There was a group of Greeks who settled in Italy in Magna Graecia, which is sort of right at the southern tip of Italy, and then there was lots of communication between them and the tribes that were already there, and so over time the stories got shared and translated over time, and it evolved. Eventually Aeneas made his way into the hands of the Etruscans. And so Aeneas did exist in one form or another long before Virgil wrote the Aeneid. And his story of coming to Italy is also something that existed prior to Virgil's poem. There are a lot of fragments of stories about Aeneas that are very different depending on who's telling it. At this point, remember, it's still very much an oral history, so it's sort of you meet someone, they tell you a story of their version of Aeneas, and then you think that looks really great, and so you remember it, and then you pass it on to someone else, and over time the story shifts and evolves and changes. And there wasn't really ever a a set main version of Aeneas's journey. It was just sort of like he made it to Italy and he helped to found our tribe, and then other tribes would say Aeneas helped to found our tribe instead. And so there was this very long tradition of Aeneas being sort of an ancestor to many different peoples in Italy. And so when Virgil codified this into sort of his unified story, there was a lot of stuff to deal with already. And so he had to sort of pick and choose what elements from existing fragments of Aeneas' story that he wanted to use in his version of the story. Now, that's not to say that this is sort of a copy or an imitation or fan fiction the way people might see it today. This was very much in the tradition of epic poets, just like Homer, who took fragments about Odysseus and his voyages and Ithaca that all existed before Homer. Homer didn't invent that. He just took all the fragments of the stories that he had heard and unified it into sort of one whole story. Now, Virgil himself is a really interesting character. Shaddy Barch, who is translating the version of the Aeneid that I'm currently reading, has some really interesting things to say about sort of what Virgil was doing while he was writing the Aeneid. And so you don't want to see the Aeneid as just simplistic imperial propaganda. He didn't mean for it to be something silly and hollow. Whenever you think of propaganda stories or propaganda movies or anything like that, it always feels very simplistic and folktale-ish, where it's like there's clear lines between good and evil, and we're on the good side and everyone else is on the evil side. And Virgil wasn't doing that. And so the translator mentions that Virgil was very aware of the fragmentary nature of Aeneas' story, and he was aware that in some versions of the story he wasn't this perfect paragon of sort of Roman ideals. And so she mentions that Virgil is sort of writing a poem that's very self-aware of the fact that it's attempting to rewrite history, because the poem overall has lots to say about things like memory, the past, rewriting memory, changing assumptions about the past and everything. And so Virgil was very aware that what he was doing was an act of propaganda, but the poem makes it clear that that's what he's doing. So it's not, it's a very self-aware poem. And she also points out that Virgil sort of almost encourages the reader to see the cracks in the story, to be aware of what it's doing. And she likens this to the practice of whenever there was like a disgraced Roman official or someone, and there was a statue of them, they would sort of replace the head of the statue or the face of the statue with someone else, but they would do it in a way that you were aware that you could see the cracks and you could see that it didn't quite line up. And so you were meant to sort of be reminded, this isn't just a statue of a person that we respect, it's a statue of a person that we respect that is sort of been superimposed over top of someone who is disgraced and we should forget. And so it's a reminder that you should forget the past because you can see the cracks, and so you know that whoever it was behind the cracked facade, that person is disgraced and should be forgotten. And so it's a kind of reminder of that. And so she points out that he's kind of doing that with the Aeneid here. So you can see the cracks in the story, but it's meant to sort of make you think about the version of the story that's being covered up, which I think is really cool. One good example of this, and there's a lot, but one good example of this is there's one version of the story where Aeneas is able to escape the sack of Troy by sort of disguising himself as a Greek soldier and hiding in their ranks and sort of sneaking out as a Greek person. And that's something that you'd expect Odysseus to do, but that's not something you'd really expect Aeneas to do, like Roman Aeneas to do. But in the poem itself, when Aeneas meets Dido, she's showing him some carvings of sort of the events of the Trojan War that she has, and one of the carvings shows Aeneas hiding amongst the Greeks, and that contradicts a version of what he tells her later. He tells the story of how he escaped from Troy, and it's a different story than what she has in the carvings. Now, that could just mean that we're supposed to see that the version that's in the carvings is wrong, even though the version in the carvings is supported by sort of earlier versions of the story. But Virgil makes it clear that there's another version of the story that's being covered up. And so we're supposed to ask ourselves, is the past, is that record of the past wrong? Or is there something else going on? And so ultimately that kind of makes Aeneas more interesting, because he comes across a little bland sometimes, but we also see kind of the person behind the person. There's the version of Aeneas who's maybe a little less scrupulous, who's maybe a little less heroic, and is a little more sneaky, and we have to kind of be aware of that. The poem is very non-complimentary of Odysseus, called Ulysses by the Romans. So we don't want to see Aeneas being like Odysseus, because Odysseus is sneaky and he's underhanded. He's not Roman, he's a Greek person. And Aeneas is better than that. But there is always this kind of subtle reminder that Aeneas is also maybe a little unscrupulous. Now, also, could this be just an error? Now, there is kind of a story, I don't know if it's apocryphal or true, but Virgil on his deathbed sort of wanted the copy that he had of the Aeneid to be destroyed. He said it wasn't good, and it could be like he didn't want to write propaganda, and so that's what his concern was. It could also be that he was concerned about the many inconsistencies that you see in the story itself, because there's some continuity errors in the poem. So it could be that, but again, those continuity errors could have been intentional. He could also have been concerned about the ending. The poem sort of ends at a very abrupt, brutal, dark place that it sort of seems to suggest that maybe there was more to the story that he was going to write, but he never had time to. It's really hard to say. So you can make decisions about the Aeneid based on what we know about Virgil, but we have the Aeneid as it is now. And so it's always interesting to sort of take it as it is, instead of saying, well, this is flawed and unfinished, and we just won't read it ever because it's clearly flawed and unfinished. Maybe he intended it to be like that. Maybe the inconsistencies are intentional, because like I said earlier, it does kind of tie into this concept of memory being changed, the past in your memory not lining up with the reality. That's a recurring theme throughout the poem, so it might have been intentional. Who knows? But we have to kind of take it as it is. It's kind of like Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. If we just said, oh, well, it's unfinished, so let's just never play it ever, we'd be missing out on appreciating the beauty of what we got. There's lots of sort of unfinished works. One good example is Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Kubla Khan. We just have kind of a fragment of the beginning, and it could have been a very long kind of epic poem, but we never got the end of it. But it's still a really compelling fragment, and so we still study it, we still read it. It's really interesting, to the point where we even made a musical starring Olivia Newton-John based on it, called Xanadu, because, the first line of the poem is, in Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. So, I don't know, it's stuck in our consciousness, and we like that poem, and so we don't want to get rid of it, because even though it's unfinished, and it's just kind of a piece of an unfinished poem, but we still want to keep a hold to it. And so, with that said, I like to look at the Aeneid as it's a complete work, and we just have to sort of work with the inconsistencies in it and its sort of abrupt ending and say, okay, as it is now, what does this tell us? How do we respond to it? What do we get out of it? How can we appreciate this work of art, even though maybe it's unfinished, but we'll never know for sure? So we just have to kind of accept that what it is. Now, there are people who will study it from the point of view of like a biographical fiction, and so they tie it specifically to what did Virgil want. And then there's others that, if you think of like Death of the Author, there's others that will say, we have the text as is. If there's things in it that maybe apply to our modern day, things that Virgil didn't even think about, then it's still valuable. So any work of art that is suitably complex, that we can still find relevance outside of its context, then it's worth studying. So people might want to dismiss the Aeneid as sort of a flawed, strange work of art, but there's a lot of really cool stuff there, and so I think we still need to read it. And so that's why I'm talking about it in these next 3 lectures. Another misconception that I see people say about the Aeneid is that it's sort of a cheap copy of the Odyssey. It's sort of doing what's already been done and then expanding that out a bit. People sort of dismiss Roman mythology as just, Greek mythology with the numbers filed off, and then they painted new names on it. And it's a lot more complicated than that. So talking about the comparisons to the Odyssey, I feel like Virgil intended the book to comment on works like the Odyssey, because he would have been aware of it. And the epic poetry tradition is very old, and a lot of people had been doing it for a long time, and there's lots of stories about voyages. You've got the Argonautica as well. And so it's not necessarily that he's just copying the Odyssey because he's out of ideas. The Aeneid is very much a commentary on the Odyssey in a way. It's sort of divided into 2 halves. The first half we'll talk about next week, and then the second half we'll talk about the week after. But the first half is sort of the Odyssey half, and then the second half is sort of the Iliad half, because it talks about a war. But the first half, it seems to be presenting Aeneas with a situation that's similar to what Odysseus faced, but the way that Aeneas deals with it is more Roman, and it's more in line with sort of Roman values and Roman ideals, and so we're able to see how Aeneas is a greater hero than Odysseus. One good example of this is the way that Aeneas handles Dido. She is a queen of Carthage, and she's a very sort of important figure in the poem, but the way that he treats her is very much a contrast to the way that Odysseus treated someone like Circe. And so we have Aeneas making decisions in service to his own destiny, his duty, and that is sort of very different from the more emotional way that Odysseus reacted to things. If you think about Circe, for example, Odysseus's men had to sort of remind him to leave because he was very happy to stay there for quite a long time. And so his men had to sort of remind him, it's like, by the way, we have to get out of here and keep going. And so Aeneas doesn't do that. His response to this situation is very much, it's kind of colder, and it's much more, nope, you're a distraction, I have a duty to do, I'm moving on. And it's very brutal for her, but we'll get into that next week. Talking about Roman mythology in general, this is going to be kind of an aside, but I think it's important because I think people aren't as familiar with Roman mythology. Like, we know the names of the planets, and we kind of see it as those are just the Roman names of Greek gods, but they're the same kind of character basically. Roman mythology is very much a melting pot of many different mythologies, including Greek, but also Etruscan, Latin, and eventually Egyptian. And so the way that the Roman gods functioned was different from the way that the Greek gods functioned. So Rome had its own gods as well that didn't have Greek analogs. So you've got gods like Quirinus, I think, and Sylvanus, who isn't just a character in Dungeons and Dragons, but they would also modify their existing gods and gave them the backstory of Greek gods. So the gods already existed, and then when they interacted with the Greeks, they would then sort of subsume characteristics of the Greek gods into their previously existing gods. So that's why their names don't always line up. When you have a character or a god who is sort of borrowed whole cloth from the Greeks, like Apollo, the Romans, did talk about Apollo, and you've also got like Proserpina, who is the Roman name for Persephone, and you can tell that they just sort of took the Greek character, moved them into their own pantheon, and then changed the name so it sounded more Latin. But you've also got gods like Venus. Like Venus and Aphrodite have very different names, and Venus existed already. And when they borrowed elements from Greek mythology and combined her with Venus, she sort of became a very similar sort of character. But Venus overall functions very differently than Aphrodite did. Another good example is Mars. Mars inherited aspects from Ares, but Mars already existed prior to that kind of mixing. In Greek mythology, Ares is a much more kind of chaotic figure. He was kind of a minor god in many ways. He was one of the 12 Olympians, and he shows up in many stories, but Ares was very much an unpredictable force in the world. He supported sort of both sides. He just liked the brawl. He just liked battle, and he wasn't really necessarily in favor of any one side unless he had kind of a personal interest in one of them. Mars, however, is very different. Mars was worshipped much more broadly in Rome, and he was much more important. And he was always he was also a god of war, but he was always in favor of Roman might and Roman strength. And so he did what he did to make sure that Rome was victorious in battle, kind of thing. They would pray to him to support them specifically. Whereas in Greek mythology, it would be more like, I'm going into battle. It would be great if Ares could help me, but they didn't always expect that he would. So the Roman gods were much less sort of elements of sort of this chaotic, unfeeling world, and who kind of caused mortals equal parts grief and joy, depending on what they were thinking of. And it was more like they were stewards of Rome itself. Everything they did was in ensuring the stability of Rome and the prosperity of the Roman people. In Greek mythology, the gods would sort of take sides in conflict. So, for example, in the Iliad, we've got characters like Apollo, who is siding with the Trojans, and then we've got Athena, who's siding with the Achaeans. And so the gods are sort of in conflict. In Roman mythology, they all would have always been on Rome's side. And the way that people interacted with the gods was a little bit different. So it was very much a kind of tit for tat sort of thing. There wasn't really a sense of a cosmic mythology. If there was, it was borrowed from other mythologies. But the mythology that mattered was the mythology surrounding Rome itself. Rome's founding. So you've got Aeneas, who's the son of Venus, and then you've got Romulus and Remus, and you've got the story of them sort of being found by a she-wolf and nursed back to health. And then you've got the conflict between the two of them. And so Roman history kind of starts as mythology. So it starts with Aeneas. It doesn't start with the creation of the earth or the universe. It starts with Aeneas coming to Italy and founding Rome, and then everything that happens in service of the strength of Rome itself. They even had like specific gods on, like, the Roman sewers had a goddess that presided over them. So it was always, it wasn't really a matter of they were natural forces of just chaos, kind of used to describe the unfeeling world. They were specifically people that you would reach out to ensure that Rome was safe. Now, people also had household gods as well. You saw this in the Doctor Who episode, The Fires of Pompeii, which is pretty accurate. And so each household had their own sort of household gods. There wasn't, they didn't necessarily always pray to the big ones, but there was always sort of minor gods that they would sort of speak to, who were in charge of making sure the house was safe and the people inside were prosperous. And then the overall, you've got like the Vestal Virgins, which was sort of a state-sanctioned priesthood, so to speak. And people would go to them, and you would make prayers and sacrifices to the gods as a means of ensuring that they kept Rome safe and prosperous. So there wasn't this sense that the gods would just have a fickle day and would decide to just, unleash a plague on Rome for no reason. It was always, we do our duty, so the gods do their duty in protecting Rome. Okay. Oh, the kitty's jumping down. Okay, he's gone now. So the Romans may have incorporated elements of Greek mythology into their gods, but the way the gods functioned was very different than they did in Greek mythology. And so people, I think, have a tendency to see Roman mythology as sort of this copy-paste kind of thing, where they just sort of take Greek figures, change the name, and say, oh, those are ours now. And that's not really what happened. It was very much a sharing of cultures. It happened over a long period of time. And again, you got that oral history. And so you've got people hearing stories from the Greeks that lived in Italy, and then those stories being passed on, and then being incorporated. Later on, when Rome sort of goes to Egypt, they take back some Egyptian gods with them and incorporate them as well. And this has been something that happens for quite a long time. And I know we like to think that there's sort of an established, codified version of everything, where it's like, this is this mythology and this is what everyone thought. But it's always going to be different. Even if you get into like Egyptian mythology, there's different creation myths depending on where you are in ancient Egypt, because different places had different creation myths, and there's completely different versions of how things came to be. So there wasn't like a unified set story of Egyptian mythology as everyone believed it equally. Today, we can't really conceive of that because we've got a very globalized world. We've also have the ability to write things down and to have sort of established records of everything. And so we can have religions today that have a set, like, codified mythology that we can refer to, whereas in ancient Greece and Rome and Egypt, they didn't have that. And so it was very much a more loosey-goosey thing. And so I know that can frustrate some people because they want there to be sort of a, as they say, like a canon, the way you think of like the biblical canon. They want there to be a canon of Greek mythology or Roman mythology, but there really isn't. It's a lot more loosey-goosey. And so once we get to Rome, as Rome gets more powerful and you've got like the Vestal Virgins and the priesthood and everything, they are able to sort of codify their own version of sort of who the gods are, who you reach out to when you want certain things, what the proper sacrifices are, what the specific festivals are. But it wasn't a matter of like, this is the story of how the universe came to be, because Rome was really only concerned with how Rome came to be. So moving on from there, I know this has kind of been long, but before I wrap this up, I wanted to talk about translations, because the Aeneid was written in Latin, and Latin is a much more modern language than Homeric Greek, which is a specific subset of ancient Greek that is notoriously difficult to translate. Latin is a little bit easier, but the thing with Latin is that the rhythm is always going to be very different when you translate something directly from Latin to English, because Latin is a very complex language. It's nuanced, but there's quite a few conjugations and declensions that will modify a word and add in things like articles and all that kind of stuff. And so you'll have like 12 different versions of one word depending on specifically how that word is being used in the sentence. And so because of that, you can fit more information into a Latin phrase than you could in English. And so if you look at, so an example of a phrase, and this is taken from a Star Trek episode, so it's in my head, but it's the phrase, and I'm going to probably pronounce this wrong. If you speak Latin, tell me what I did wrong, but it's si vis pacem parabellum. It's 5 words. And when you translate it directly to English, it means like, if you want peace, then prepare for war. 8 words, when you translate it to English, that coming from 5 words in Latin. And that's just a short example, but that's kind of the problem that a lot of translators face. And so when they're translating Latin to English, they have to decide if they want to have really long lines, because you can very easily do a very faithful one-to-one sort of translation, but the lines would all be really, really long. It would be a really long poem, almost like double or triple the length of what it is that we have it. And that's not always practical. And so a lot of times they want to modify the line length so that it feels more poetic. It also, if there's nuance that's lost in the translation, sometimes a shorter word will work better, because maybe there's an English word that says something that a Latin phrase doesn't, even though Latin is a pretty complex language as it is. But anytime they would translate it, you have to sort of make a judgment call as to what you're going to do with the line length. And so I have 2 copies of the Aeneid. I need more because, you know me, I love collecting epic poems. And the way that the translators work with the original Latin is really interesting, and you can kind of see how it shapes how the word, like how the lines feel, because there's some rhythmic things that just don't work in English because Latin is very different. And so a rhythmic detail in Latin, if you try to translate it, you can kind of approximate it in English, but the stress on the syllables is always going to be different. It's always going to sound a little bit different. And so there's also things like puns that don't translate well, rhymes that don't translate well, internal sibilance or alliteration, stuff like that you have to kind of work with to make it kind of interesting in English. And so I've got two examples here. So this is Robert Fagel's translation. This is the first one that I read. This is probably the most common one that I think people have read. It's a really good translation, but it has sort of slightly longer lines, and so you can hear the rhythm of it. So I'm going to read the first part here. Wars and a man I sing, an exile driven on by fate. He was the first to flee the coast of Troy, destined to reach Lavinian shores and Italian soil. Yet many blows he took on land and sea from the gods above, thanks to cruel Juno's relentless rage, and many losses he bore in battle too, before he could found a city, bring his gods to Latium, source of the Latin race, the Albion lords, and the high walls of Rome. So that's the beginning. And you can tell it very much sounds like the beginning of a Homer poem. So you've got kind of an invocation to the muse. The line right after that is, "Tell me, muse, how it all began. Why was Juno outraged?" So this is Robert Fagel's translation of the Aeneid. Next up is Shaddy Barch's translation. This is what I'm reading right now. This is a newer translation, and it's phenomenal. I'm really enjoying it so far. So her lines are quite a bit shorter, but she did that so she could sort of capture the specific rhythm and feel of the original Latin poetry. And so it's really, really good. So this is the beginning of this translation. My song is of war and a man, a refuge by fate, the first from Troy to Italy's Lavinian shores, battered much on land and sea by blows from gods, obliging brutal Juno's unforgetting rage. He suffered much in war as well, all to plant his town and gods in Latium. From here would rise the Latin race, the Alban lords, and Rome's high walls. Remember for me, muse, tell me the reasons. What pain, what insult to her power moved the queen of gods to drive a man famous for piety through misery on misery? Can such anger grip gods' minds? So I love the way that this one reads. It has this briskness to it. It's very immediate and very kind of visceral, and I love the way that it moves. Now, Robert Fagel's translation is still really, really good. It sort of sounds a little bit denser because the lines are longer, and so it has a very different feel. This one is sort of going for the original feel of the Latin, and there's a lot of Latin words and sentences and stuff that the way it's pronounced, you would run the words together. So you could have like 5 words, and the way that you'd pronounce it would be sort of, you'd cut off the last syllable of some of them so it could run together. And so it had a much more immediate feel. I'd love to get a copy of this in Latin. I can't speak Latin, but you know, just because I would love to be able to see sort of how the original flows and just what it sort of sounds like, even if I can't understand what I'm reading, just to be able to follow kind of the rhythm of it. I know you can get it online for free, so I have to look that up, but yeah. So this is the Aeneid. This is the one that I'm reading right now. I really, really like it. I would say that the Robert Fagles one is probably more accessible because the lines are longer. He's able to fit in a bit more information, and so it flows a little smoother. This one is much more about the kind of special effects of the writing, because it's capturing the line lengths of the original Latin, and so it feels much more punchy. It feels much more immediate, and it moves much faster, and so it's really cool sounding, but because it's written like that, it can be sort of difficult to follow specifically what's going on at times. And so if you're brand new to epic poetry and you've never read any of it before, and you want sort of someone who can sort of be readable and accessible, then I would say Robert Fagles is great. His translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey are classics for a reason, and his version of the Aeneid is really good. It's the first one that I read, and I really enjoyed it. So, with that said, I'm going to let you go now. Next week, I'm going to be talking about the first half of the Aeneid. After that, I think I'm going to be doing my June wrap-up, and so I will be talking about the second half of the Aeneid after that. But overall, it's a wonderful poem. I'm really enjoying my reread so far, and there's a lot to talk about. It's very complicated in ways that I think make it more interesting, and it's also a poem that really invites discussion because there's kind of ambiguity in certain things, and so hearing about different people's interpretations of it is really, really interesting. So if you're reading it along with me, there are free versions of it online that you can get easily. It's in the public domain, and there's lots of translations of it. And so if you have a different interpretation of something, let me know in the comments. I'd love to talk about it because there's different ways you can read this. So with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week. And in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.